The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in stages, a laugh here, a nudge there, someone leaning over to whisper something to the guy next to him. Because when the name got passed around that afternoon, most people's first reaction wasn't fear. It was amusement. 130 pounds, 5'7" on a generous day, standing across from a man who made the door frame look small. Nobody in that room thought they were about to watch something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. They were wrong. San Francisco, late 1967. The training hall sat on the second floor of a building on Broadway Street. Fogged windows. Maybe 15, 18 guys. Inside, enough body heat to turn December cold into something thick and close. It wasn't a formal event. Word had moved the way it always does in those circles. One guy told another, who told two more, and by the time the afternoon arrived, the room was fuller than usual. Nobody was pretending they'd just happened to stop by. Bruce Lee was coming to spar. The way that information traveled carried a particular energy, not fear, something closer to amused curiosity, a name that didn't quite match what people expected. A name like that to look like walking through a door. The room had its own hierarchy. You could feel it without anyone saying a word. Who stood where? Who deferred to whom? Serious fighters. Men who'd trained for years, who understood their own limits and kept showing up anyway. They were comfortable, no malice in it, just the ordinary confidence of people who hadn't been given a reason yet to feel otherwise. Near the far wall, one of the bigger guys, 6'2" easy, north of 220, was wrapping his hands mid-conversation. He glanced toward the door once. Looked back. Whatever he saw didn't interrupt his sentence. That was the room's posture. Waiting, but not expectant. Then Bruce walked in. No noise. No entourage. He came through the door and stood just inside it, taking in the space the way you take stock of a room you've never entered before. Practical. Quiet. His eyes moved without landing anywhere particular. Dark training clothes. Nothing fitted for an audience. What almost everyone noticed first, and they'd each say this later, separately, wasn't his size. It was that he seemed completely unbothered. Not casual. Something more precise. Still in the way a person gets when they're not spending energy on things that usually cost energy. The performance of confidence, the management of how a room sees you. He just stood there, 130 pounds of quiet. And the room, for another minute or two, continued around him like nothing unusual had walked in. He didn't warm up the way everyone else warmed up. Most fighters have a ritual, shadowboxing, bouncing on the balls of their feet, throwing combinations at the air to loosen the shoulders and signal to the room and to themselves that they're somebody worth watching. It's partly physical preparation. Mostly it's psychological. A way of occupying space before the actual occupation begins. Bruce didn't do any of that. He found a spot near the edge of the mat, set down the small bag he'd carried in, and stood there. Occasionally he'd roll one shoulder or shift his weight slightly. Nothing performed, nothing meant to be seen. A couple of guys glanced over, waiting for something more. When nothing came, they went back to their own preparation. What the room didn't know, couldn't have known just by looking, was what those years had actually built inside that frame. He'd started in Hong Kong, Wing Chun under Ip Man, beginning around age 13. Not a hobby. A serious, methodical study of how force actually works. Angles, structure, the mechanics of contact between bodies. By the time he was 18, he'd already begun pulling apart everything he'd learned, questioning it, testing it against other systems. That habit, that refusal to accept any method as complete, never left him. By 1967, he'd spent years developing what he called Jeet Kune Do. Not a style exactly, more like a philosophy with a physical vocabulary. The core idea was almost painfully simple. Don't do what's unnecessary. Don't carry techniques that don't survive contact with reality. What that produced in practice was a fighter who'd stripped everything down to what actually worked, and then drilled those things until they lived in his nervous system rather than his memory. The room saw a small man standing quietly at the edge of a mat. They weren't wrong about what they saw. They were just reading it incorrectly. The way you can look directly at something and still completely misunderstand what it means. Across the mat, the big man hadn't stopped watching him. His name was Jeet. Not a fighter by profession, but the kind of man who didn't need a profession to be dangerous. He'd come up through wrestling, high school, then some collegiate experience that never went anywhere formal but left him with the kind of body awareness that's hard to fake and harder to acquire after a certain age. Somewhere along the way he'd added striking. Nothing technical. Mostly the natural result of being large enough that technique becomes optional when your reach is that long and your hands are that heavy. He was well liked in that room. That mattered. He wasn't a bully about it. Never the type to go looking for something to prove, but when sparring got serious, when somebody needed to understand something real about the difference between training and contact, Jeet was usually the one who delivered that lesson. He'd ended sessions early before. Not through injury. Nothing malicious. Just by making the other person do a quiet internal calculation about whether continuing was worth it. Most of the time, it wasn't. The room trusted him the way rooms trust the person who's consistently demonstrated they know what they're doing. It's not given lightly in those spaces. He'd earned it. He finished wrapping his hands and turned fully toward the mat. For the first time since Bruce had arrived, Jeet looked at him directly. Not a threatening look, more evaluative than anything. The unconscious sizing up that experienced fighters do automatically, cataloging reach, stance, weight distribution. Whatever calculation he ran, it didn't take long. He rolled his neck once, slowly, and then he smiled. It wasn't an unfriendly smile. That almost made it worse. It was the smile of a man who'd already decided how the afternoon was going to go. Not out of arrogance exactly, but out of a kind of honest arithmetic. He'd looked at the numbers, and the numbers made sense to him. 130 pounds. 5'7". The math felt straightforward. It wasn't. It didn't come from Jeet. That's the part worth noting. Jeet hadn't said anything. He was still across the mat, adjusting his hand wraps, doing what fighters do before things get real. The comment came from somewhere in the middle of the room. One of the guys standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching the whole thing unfold with the comfortable detachment of someone who'd already decided what he was seeing. He said it quietly, almost conversationally. The way people say things they genuinely believe are just observations rather than provocations. "This gonna be quick." A couple of guys nearby heard it. One of them smiled. Nobody pushed back. The words moved through the room the way small sounds do in quiet spaces, not loud enough to demand attention, but present enough that anyone paying attention caught them. Bruce was maybe 12 feet away. Whether he heard it directly or felt the shift in the room's energy, something registered. His expression didn't change. That was the thing. No jaw tightening, no redirected gaze, no visible recalibration of his posture. The stillness that had been there since he walked in simply remained, uninterrupted, unchanged, almost inconveniently calm. But something in the room shifted anyway. Hard to describe precisely. Not tension exactly, more like the air pressure adjusting slightly before weather changes. The guys nearest to Bruce glanced at him, then at each other. The conversation near the far wall dropped half a volume. Jeet looked up from his wraps. He'd caught something in the room's frequency, too, not the comment itself, maybe, but the response to it. His eyes moved to Bruce. Bruce wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He picked up a small towel from his bag and was folding it with the kind of focused, unhurried attention most people reserve for things that actually require concentration. A towel, folded slowly and carefully while a room quietly underestimated him. Then he set it down, looked up. And for the first time since walking through that door, he walked toward the center of the mat. The size gap, standing there in the center of the mat, was visually jarring. Not dramatic in a movie sense, just genuinely strange to look at. The kind of physical disparity that makes your brain run a quick, involuntary check. Like something's been arranged incorrectly. Jean had 4, maybe 5 inches on him. Somewhere between 80 and 90 pounds. His shoulders were the kind of wide that changes how a person moves through door frames. Bruce stood across from him and looked, by every external measure, like the wrong person to be standing there. The room had gone quieter, not silent. Someone coughed near the back, someone else shifted weight, but the ambient noise had dropped in that particular way it does when people stop pretending they're not watching something. Jean settled into his stance, comfortable. Weight distributed the way wrestlers learn early, low center, grounded, hard to move. He'd done this hundreds of times. His body knew the geometry of it without thinking. Bruce didn't bounce, didn't circle aggressively, didn't perform readiness. He just stood there in a position that looked almost casual, until you noticed the details. Weight slightly forward, hands positioned in a way that seemed relaxed but covered angles that most conventional stances left open. His eyes were on Jean's chest, not his face, the place experienced fighters watch because the chest telegraphs movement before the limbs execute it. What the room was seeing, without having the language for it, was the product of years spent solving a very specific problem. The problem wasn't how to fight someone your own size. That's a simpler equation. The problem Bruce had spent years working on, almost obsessively, was how force actually transfers between bodies of different mass, where conventional physics seems to favor the larger man and where it doesn't. He'd found the places where it doesn't. Jean rolled his shoulders once. Comfortable, unhurried. He still hadn't stopped smiling. Somewhere behind them, the guy who'd said this gonna be quick shifted his weight forward just slightly. He wanted a better view. They moved at the same moment, not dramatically. No lunge, no explosive opening combination. Just the subtle, almost imperceptible shift that happens when two people stop waiting and start reading each other in real time. The room leaned forward without realizing it. Jean came first. A probing jab. Not committed, not meant to land clean. The kind of shot experienced fighters throw early to measure distance, to feel out reaction time, to see what flinches and what doesn't. Bruce wasn't where he was. Not a dramatic sidestep, something smaller than that. A fractional weight shift, a slight rotation at the hip, and the jab passed through air that had just recently been occupied. Jean's fist landed on nothing. The room didn't react yet. It happened too fast and too quietly to process immediately. Jean reset. Reassessed. His expression stayed neutral. But something behind his eyes had changed, a small involuntary recalibration. He'd felt the non-contact differently than he expected. There was no stumbling, no panicked retreat on the other side. Just absence, clean and immediate, where a target should have been. He came again. This time more deliberate. A combination, jab followed by a cross with real weight behind it. Bruce slipped the jab, deflected the cross with a forearm that redirected rather than blocked, and for a half-second was inside Jean's guard at a distance that made Jean's size almost irrelevant. Then he was back outside again. The whole exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds. The room was silent in a different way now. Not the comfortable quiet of people watching something expected, something tighter than that. A few guys exchanged glances. The man near the back who'd been half leaning against the wall was standing fully upright. Jean stood still for a moment. He wasn't hurt, wasn't rattled in any obvious way. But the smile, the easy arithmetic smile that had been there since he first looked across the mat, was gone, completely gone. And its absence said more than anything else in the room. What happened next is the part that's hardest to describe accurately. Not because it was complicated, because it was the opposite. So compressed, so stripped of anything unnecessary, that the people who were there struggled afterward to explain exactly what they'd seen. The sequence was over before their eyes had finished processing the beginning of it. Jean came forward with intention this time. No more probing. He'd made his adjustment, committed to closing distance. Because at close range, weight and strength become the dominant variables, and he knew it. It was the logical move, the correct move, against almost anyone else in that room. He moved in fast. Bruce didn't retreat. That was the first thing that registered wrong. Every instinct, every conventional read of the situation said the smaller man creates distance, stays outside, uses movement. Bruce did the opposite. He stepped in, toward the pressure, into the space Jean was trying to occupy. What followed happened in under 2 seconds, a simultaneous deflection and strike. Not sequential, not one then the other, but genuinely at the same moment. The defense and the offense collapsed into a single motion. The strike landed in the midsection with something that witnesses later described not as a punch exactly, but as a transfer, like force had been delivered from somewhere deeper than the arm. Jean's body received it before his mind did. His legs went first. Not a collapse, more like a sudden, involuntary reassessment by his nervous system about whether standing was still the priority. He went down heavily, one knee then both, and stayed there for a moment with the particular stillness of someone whose internal systems are running an unexpected diagnostic. The sound the room made wasn't cheering. It wasn't gasping either. It was something in between. The collective exhale of people who'd been holding their breath without knowing it, released all at once into a silence that felt strangely respectful. Nobody moved. Bruce stood exactly where he'd been when it ended. Hadn't stepped back, hadn't looked around the room. He was watching Jean, making sure he was okay. Jean sat up slowly, not the way a hurt man sits up, carefully, testing things. More like a man surfacing from something he needed a moment to process before rejoining the room. His hands went to the mat briefly, steadying. Then he looked up, not at Bruce particularly, just at the middle distance, the way people look when they're doing internal accounting. Nobody rushed over, nobody said anything immediately. That silence lasted longer than silences usually last in rooms full of people. Maybe 6-7 seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you're inside one. Bruce hadn't moved from where he was standing. Hadn't stepped back to create ceremonial distance, hadn't raised anything, hadn't looked around the room for confirmation of what had just happened. He was watching Jean with the same quiet attention he'd carried in through the door, present, calm, completely without theater. A couple of guys near the front exchanged a look, not the excited look of people who'd just seen something spectacular. Something more complicated than that. The look of people quietly revising something they'd been certain about. Jean got to his feet, took a breath. And then, this is the part that said everything about who he was. He nodded. A single, unhurried nod in Bruce's direction, not gracious in a performed way, just honest. The acknowledgement of a man who understood what had happened and respected it without needing to make a moment out of it. Bruce nodded back. That was the whole exchange. No words, no analysis, no extended conversation about mechanics or technique. The two men who'd actually been inside the thing seemed the least interested in discussing it. It was the rest of the room that couldn't quite settle. The guy who'd said this gonna be quick was quiet now. Had been since the moment Jean went down. He wasn't embarrassed exactly. Just occupied, working something out privately that didn't have a clean resolution yet. Most of them were. The room had come in with a fixed idea about how size and strength translated into outcome. That idea was now sitting somewhere uncomfortable, waiting to be re-examined. Nobody talked much on the way out. That's the detail that stays with you when you hear accounts from the people who were there. Not the strike, not the speed, not even the moment Jean went down. It's the quiet afterward. The particular quality of silence that followed men out of that building and into the December cold of Broadway Street, where the air was sharp and the city moved around them like nothing unusual had happened. Because nothing unusual had, really. Not by the world's accounting. No cameras, no audience beyond those 18 or so men. No record of it that would surface anywhere official. Just a Tuesday afternoon in a fogged-up training hall above a sporting goods store where a 130-pound man had walked in, said almost nothing, and rearranged something fundamental in the thinking of everyone present. The thing is, Bruce hadn't tried to prove anything. That's what made it difficult to file away neatly. There was no performance in it, no moment where he'd looked around the room to collect what he'd earned. He came in, he engaged when it was time to engage, and then he was done. Whatever the room did with it afterward wasn't his concern. That quality, that absolute indifference to how he was perceived, was in some ways the most unsettling thing about the afternoon, more than the speed, more than the technique. The men in that room were used to fighters who needed something from the room: validation, reputation, the particular satisfaction of being seen as dangerous. Bruce didn't need any of it. He'd spent years, real years, methodical and unglamorous, solving problems that most people in that room hadn't thought to ask. Not how to look like a fighter, how force actually moves, where mass becomes irrelevant. What happens when you remove everything from a fighting system that doesn't survive honest contact with reality? What's left, when you do that long enough and seriously enough, is something that doesn't look like much from the outside. Until it does. The men who laughed when they heard his name that afternoon didn't make the same mistake twice, not because they feared him, though some of them probably did, quietly, in the honest part of themselves, but because they'd watched something that reset their internal calibration about what was actually possible inside a human body trained with that kind of singular focus. Gene understood it best, maybe. He'd felt it directly, which is a different kind of knowing than watching it. In the weeks after, when people asked him about that afternoon, he didn't have a dramatic answer for them. He'd just say, "The size thing. It doesn't work the way you think it does." That was it. No elaboration. He didn't need to elaborate. Anyone who'd been in that room already knew exactly what he meant. And anyone who hadn't, well, some things don't compress into language without losing the part that matters. Bruce Lee walked out of that building the same way he walked in. Quietly, without looking for anything the room might have owed him. The city received him back without ceremony. He had work to do,